In just 37 days, 5 of Europe's greatest powers were at war. This wasn't the war of cavalry charges and honor that leaders had once known. This was the war of trenches, of artillery, of unrelenting mud. The old world had just stepped into its grave, and didn't know it yet. The early days were fast, furious, and full of deadly optimism. German troops pushed quickly through Belgium and northern France, approaching Paris with shocking speed. But at the Battle of the Marne, the French and British forces held their ground. The German advance faltered, then retreated. Both sides dug trenches and the war stopped moving. Trenches weren't just defensive lines. They were homes, hospitals, and hell combined. Across fields once green with crops, a new world emerged, the world of trench warfare. From the North Sea to the Swiss border stretched a line of filth, barbed wire, and death. Soldiers slept in filth. Rain turned the ground to soup. Limbs froze. Shells fell without warning. The land between the lines, no man's land, was a graveyard for any who dared to cross. Yet even as the Western Front stalled, the war spread beyond. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East. That spring, the Allies launched a bold campaign at Gallipoli, hoping to punch through to Russia via the Dardanelles. British, French, and Anzac troops landed on steep Turkish cliffs, but what followed was disaster. The terrain was brutal. Ottoman resistance fierce. Disease took more than bullets. After months of carnage, the Allies withdrew. Over 250,000 soldiers were lost in vain. It was a gamble paid in blood. Elsewhere, alliances shifted. Italy, promised land and power, broke with its former allies and joined the Entente. Another front opened, this time in the Alps, high, frozen, and treacherous. But if Gallipoli was the war's great failure, Ypres was its great horror. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces unleashed chlorine gas upon Allied trenches. The yellow-green fog drifted silently, suffocating and blinding everything in its path. Soldiers drowned on dry land, their lungs filled with acid. Gas masks were invented on the spot, cloth soaked in urine, desperation as science. That same year, under the cover of war, something darker unfolded. In the East, the Ottoman Empire initiated what would later be known as the Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million Armenians were deported, starved, or slaughtered. Entire families vanished. The world barely noticed. The war was loud. Their screams were silent. By the end of 1915, there were no victors, only exhaustion. Millions were dead or maimed. Whole towns emptied. Mothers buried sons. And sons returned home without limbs, or not at all. The lines on the maps had barely changed, but the world's innocence had been stripped away. What was once called the war to end all wars had just begun. The trenches were not a temporary strategy. They were a new way of existing. The rifles were no longer the greatest threat. Gas, disease, and despair took more lives than bullets. The old rules of warfare no longer applied. Honor had drowned in the mud. The war had consumed Europe's youth and was now hungry for more. In the looming shadow of what was yet to come. Verdun, the Somme, total war and revolution. 1915 stood as the moment the world realized it was burning. And the flames were not going out. In the frozen hills of France and the rivers of blood that would soon soak the soil of Verdun and the Somme, humanity would face something it had never known before. A scale of death so vast, even victory would feel like defeat. Because in 1916, the earth itself would bleed. And no one, on either side, would be the same again. This is Whispers of the World Wars, where forgotten moments speak louder than time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because history has a voice, and it's whispering still. The sound that echoed across the scarred landscape in 1916 was not thunder, though it rumbled with fury. It was the voice of the earth itself, torn apart by artillery and soaked with the blood of empires. That year marked a turning point in the war. It was no longer about advancing or retreating, it was about enduring. Verdun became a name synonymous with suffering. In February 1916, Germany set its sights on the French fortress city with a brutal intent to bleed France dry. For nearly a year, soldiers clashed over shattered ground where entire forests had vanished and villages were erased. Men died for meters, and those who survived were haunted forever. By December, over 700,000 lives had been claimed. The soil itself seemed to reject the carnage, yet Verdun never fell. As France stood its ground, the British took action to relieve the pressure. Along the river Somme, they prepared an offensive they believed would change the course of the war. The bombardment was thunderous, and confidence ran high. But when the whistles blew on July 1, 1916, and British troops emerged from their trenches, they stepped into a nightmare. The German defenses were intact. Machine guns cut down men by the thousands. That single day remains the bloodiest in British military history, with nearly 60,000 casualties. The Battle of the Somme dragged on through the summer and into the autumn. Tanks appeared on the battlefield for the first time, massive steel beasts rolling through craters and mud. But the technology was still new, the terrain unforgiving. 5 months of combat led to over 1 million casualties. The front barely shifted. Hope drowned in the mud. As the war raged on the Western Front, another empire began to crumble. In Russia, 1917 brought revolution. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and a provisional government took control. But the people, exhausted by war and hunger, were not satisfied. In October, the Bolsheviks overthrew the government, promising peace, land, and bread. Russia would soon exit the war, but the cost was civil war, repression, and chaos. The collapse of the Eastern Front gave Germany renewed hope. Yet on the Western Front, morale among the Allies was faltering. French troops, devastated by the failed Nivelle offensive, began to mutiny. In Belgium, the Battle of Passchendaele turned the fields into swamps. Soldiers drowned in mud. Entire battalions disappeared without gaining more than a few yards. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States could no longer ignore the conflict. German submarines had sunk American ships. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany urged Mexico to wage war on the U.S. In April 1917, America entered the war. Their troops would not arrive in full force immediately, but their presence sent a signal. Fresh strength was coming to the Allies, and Germany's time was running short. In 1918, with Russia out and American reinforcements still arriving, Germany gambled everything on one final offensive. It began with success. Using new infiltration tactics, German forces pushed back the Allies and came dangerously close to Paris. But their momentum could not last. The Allies, now under unified command, launched a counteroffensive, the 100 Days. With American troops now fully committed, the tide turned. German forces, exhausted and outnumbered, began to collapse. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed. The war had ended. But peace was fragile. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles reshaped the world map. Germany was blamed entirely for the war, stripped of territory, forced to pay reparations, and left humiliated. Empires that had ruled for centuries vanished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. New nations were born. Old wounds were left open. The world had changed, but not healed. From 1916 to 1919, the war became more than a battle of armies. It became a struggle for the survival of civilization. Fields turned to graveyards. Families were shattered. The very idea of honor in war seemed obsolete. And as soldiers limped home to silence, and leaders gathered to sign treaties in gold-trimmed halls, something darker stirred beneath the surface. Because though the world celebrated peace, in its shadow, anger smoldered. Grudges deepened. And history, always listening, began to whisper again. The storm had passed. But another was already on the horizon. And next time, it would roar even louder. This is Whispers of the World Wars, where forgotten moments speak louder than time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because history has a voice, and it's whispering still. It didn't begin with bombs. It began with silence. The kind of silence that creeps in after the last gunshot echoes, when soldiers return to cities that no longer feel like home, and victors wear smiles that don't quite reach their eyes. The Great War had ended, but peace was a mask, thin and trembling. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fledgling democracy, was born in humiliation. The economy groaned under reparations. Former soldiers wandered jobless, broken by the trenches. The scars of war were now stitched into daily life. By 1920, right-wing paramilitary groups roamed the streets. The Kapp Putsch, a failed coup by monarchists, showed how brittle democracy truly was. The left was no better. A workers' uprising in the Ruhr was crushed with violence. Germany became a battlefield of ideologies. In the East, revolution had reshaped a titan. The Russian Civil War continued to rage. From 1919 to 1922, famine, purges, and warlordism devoured millions. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, emerged victorious, forging the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. What began as revolution now hardened into regime. In the West, the fear of Bolshevism became a specter. The Red Scare gripped America. Strikes were crushed. Immigrants were watched. Civil liberties trembled in the name of order. Even beyond Europe, the world reeled. In the Middle East, Britain and France carved up the remains of the Ottoman Empire. Mandates were handed out like prizes. In Turkey, a war of independence began. Under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a republic rose from the empire's ashes by 1923. The caliphate would not last much longer. In India, protests grew louder. Gandhi led peaceful resistance. The ideals of nationalism spread like sparks across colonized lands. The war had not just redrawn maps, it had awakened identities. Back in Germany, things grew worse. By 1923, inflation became hyperinflation. The mark collapsed. A loaf of bread that once cost a few coins now cost billions. People used currency as wallpaper. Children built kites from it. Wealth evaporated overnight. Then came the occupation of the Ruhr. When Germany defaulted on reparations, French and Belgian troops marched into its industrial heart. Germans responded with passive resistance, strikes, shutdowns, sabotage. The economy imploded further. In the chaos, a fringe group seized its chance. In November 1923, in a Munich beer hall, a former soldier named Adolf Hitler and his followers attempted a coup. The beer hall putsch failed. Hitler was arrested. But in his trial, he didn't shrink. He spoke like a prophet. Newspapers printed his words. The sentence, 5 years. He served less than one. In prison, he began to write, but the world didn't listen. By 1924, with help from the Dawes Plan, American loans stabilized the German economy, temporarily. The chaos receded. Streets calmed. Hope flickered. But beneath the surface, old wounds hadn't healed. They had hardened. Nations watched each other through narrowed eyes. Veterans remembered. Revolutionaries whispered. And in the pages of a prison manuscript, a darker future was already being imagined. The world wanted to forget the war. To laugh again. To rebuild. But history was not done with them. Because just as the dust began to settle, just as the world began to dream again, something new stirred in the shadows. And this time, it would not come in khaki or cavalry. It would come draped in flags. And it would march not to the sound of drums, but to the rhythm of fear. The whisper had begun to rise again. And somewhere in the silence, the next fire was already catching spark. This is Whispers of the World Wars, where forgotten moments speak louder than time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because history has a voice, and it's whispering still.